Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Read Smart, the official podcast of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. My name is Toby Mundy, and I'm the director of the prize. Today, we're talking to the historian, author, and dance critic of The New Yorker, Jennifer Homans. Jennifer is the author of what is now widely regarded as the definitive biography of George Balanchine, Mr. B, Balanchine's 20th Century, which is shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize 2023 and is published in the UK by Granta Books and in the United States by Random House. Considered by many to be the greatest choreographer who ever lived, the protagonist of Jennifer's book intersected with some of the most significant historical events of his century, the 20th century, as well as modernising ballet in dramatic new ways. Based on a decade of unprecedented research, the book tells the story of the man who the New York Times has called the Shakespeare of dancing. Welcome to the podcast, Jennifer, and congratulations on being shortlisted for the prize.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll get into the life of Balanchine a bit shortly, but what was it about his work that made the New York Times call him the Shakespeare of dance?
Well, this is a choreographer whose art was really on par with someone like Picasso or Matisse, both of whom he worked with. Stravinsky, also a key player in his life. His dances are both, incredibly wide-ranging, from things that are joyous and beautiful to what is probably the central theme in his work, which is loss and unrequited love. So there's a great array, and there's also a way in which he really recast the human body in its relationship to space and to music. And if, to put it in a sort of as brief a way as I can, he took away the tonal center, or perhaps we could say the 20th century took away the tonal center. And he began really with a sort of body in fragments and then rebuilt it to something that was both fragile and strong and incredibly vulnerable. So I think this was absolutely captivating to audiences, among them myself.
Balanchine described himself at one point in your book as a cloud in trousers, which is an amazing description for an amazing way for a person to describe themselves. What did he mean by that?
So that's a line from a Mayakovsky poem, the Russian poet. And I think what he meant by it was a poem that was written during the Russian Revolution, and that was a keystone moment in his life. I mean, he was born in 1904 under the last Tsar, and he was 10 when the First World War started, and then 13 when the Russian Revolution started. So a poet who was working at that time, who was also Georgian, was a big force in his life. And the Cloud in Trousers poem is very is violent and a difficult poem. So that's kind of the background. But I think the way it functioned in his life was a way of saying, there's the cloud, which is the artist, and almost the mystic, the thing that's undescribable, the thing that's metaphysical, that can't be pinned down. And then there's the trousers, which is the man, the everyday, the earthly being who eats and drinks and craves all the bodily cravings, sex, hunger, cold, hot, sensuality. So he was always balancing these two extremes, both in his life and in his dances, between this spiritual side, almost a kind of quest for the fourth dimension, as he put it, or he would say to the dancers, "Can you peel an orange with your eyes?" That kind of thing, something that is and then this everydayness, which he wanted to get away from. He was trying to make an art that transcended the everyday.
Gosh. So let's go back to his early life. As you say, he was born in 1904, but he wasn't Russian, was he? He was Georgian, is that right?
I mean, he's Russian by birth, but he's Georgian both by identity and by his father's birth. So, he definitely saw himself as Georgian, especially, in his life in exile because he hated the USSR and he hated communism. He was a real Cold Warrior in that sense. And so the Georgian identity had to do with, and this is something we can really relate to today in many ways, the national identity of the Georgian state as opposed to its encompassment by the Russian Empire. So, his father was very involved in politics and in Georgian nationalism at the turn of the century. So he inherited that, and he really took that to his core.
And his mother's life was completely transformed by what looks like a kind of magical event, by winning the lottery. What were the effects of that on the family?
Yeah, this is an amazing thing. I mean, it was a family of, his father was a musician and composer. His mother we know less about, but certainly not from any kind of wealth or standing in Russian society. And just before Balanchine was born, she wins the lottery, and suddenly they're rich. So in Imperial Russia, this means a lot. It means you can buy stature, you can buy nannies and cooks and a beautiful apartment. So he's born into this kind of almost fantasy wealth, which quickly disappears because his father squanders the money and they end up back where they started. So it's a moment, but a moment of insight into the Imperial Russian system, really, and the Imperial Russian life of someone in the aristocracy, which vanishes. He always remembered, that they had a carriage with a white horse, and one day the horse, bucked and spilled the whole carriage over, which is kind of a little bit like what happened to them.
Very Dostoevskian, goodness me.
Exactly.
But that sort of rather gilded childhood contrasted with his teenage years and when he was swept up by the revolution, the Russian Revolution. Tell us, a new extraordinary hardship at that time. Tell us a little bit about that experience in Petersburg.
Yeah, I mean, he was by then a student at the Tsar's theater school, which is a boarding school. So he was not living with his family anymore. And the war, of course, and the revolution threw the entire society and culture into disarray, including his family, which dispersed. And so his mother was here and there around, but he was alone, really, at the school. And he was on the street, and he was starving, and he was cold. They had no heat. He had boils growing on his skin. He contracted TB and was spitting blood. This is a moment of incredible hardship that he never, ever forgot. And yet, as he sort of came of age in that moment and the years following the revolution, it became, in fact, one of the great sources of his art, because he became involved in the radical movements, artistic movements of that time. And so I thought of it, as kind of hunger and revelation. And these two things just forced together in an uncomfortable but real legacy in his life.
At one point, they were so hungry he was forced to eat wild cats or stray cats. Is that right? Did I read that?
Yes, that's right. And they were even known to go into the basements and, catch rats with their own hands if they were that hungry. So, they were eating coffee grind cake and stealing fish from anybody who had them, or mainly from the military. The theaters were ice cold, and you could see the breath as they went onto stage. If you dropped a glass of water, it would immediately be an ice skating rink. It's a moment that's hard to imagine, and yet is sort of seared into his soul. He had nightmares about it for the rest of his life.
Do you think it changed his relationship? This experience of intense privation and hunger changed his relationship with his body and changed his sense of the human body?
Oh, completely. I mean, this is a big theme in the book because, as he put it, I almost died many times. And I mean, in a way, he should have died during the revolution. He didn't have a strong constitution. He did have TB. He ended up eventually, after he went into exile in Europe in the 1920s, he ended up in a Magic Mountain sanatorium in which he barely survived the TB, but somehow he magically did. So this idea that death is possible at any moment was something that he learned very early on. And he, one of the things that he would say to his dancers constantly as he tried to get them to summon the energy for a moment in a dance, defy death and be so alive that you can't even think of that. He would say, "You might be dead tomorrow. What are you saving it for? Don't give me everything. Give me everything, because when you walk out this door, it might be over."
Well, we might come back to the scale of the demands he made upon his dancers later. After the revolution, he went into exile, as you say, and sort of joined the caravan through the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Weimar, Germany. Is that right?
That's correct. Exactly. With, I try to sort of, there's an overview in a way of this mass exodus at this period when empires are collapsing and the movement of refugees and people. And he's part of that. And so are many of the people that he ends up collaborating with. So it's a kind of moment. He goes to Weimar. He's pretty much lost there until he finds his way to Paris and to Serge Diaghilev, the impresario, Russian impresario, who had been there for some time now and was the great leader of the Ballet Russe. So that connection, another Russian connection, saved him in a way. But all along the way, he's absorbing everything. I mean, this was his exile to Europe in the 1920s was a great education. I mean, as he put it, I walked into the room and there was Matisse and Ravel, and he said, I didn't know who they were, but I learned.
He didn't stay in Paris, did he? Why? What took him to the United States in the mid-30s?
Yeah, he left Paris in 1933, just as Hitler was coming to power. He had this way of sort of leaving these civilizations that were collapsing in the very 20th century story. He left because he was somebody who believed strongly in fate and chance. And I mean, this was remarkable to me, that he really wasn't afraid. And this living in the moment, this kind of radical now that he embraced because of his own tumultuous and unstable past, was just one of the rules he lived by. And Lincoln Kirstein was an American from Boston, from a German emigre family, and he had sort of set himself the task of being an American Diaghilev, of bringing classical dance, or dance that he thought was classical, to the United States. And he fixated on Balanchine eventually as somebody who could help him do that. So there's this moment where basically he comes backstage, or they meet at a party after the performance, and then agree to talk. And he proposes to Balanchine, come to the United States, we'll start a company. And Balanchine says yes. So it's a big sort of another dive into an unknown.
There's that line of Shakespeare's, I think in Coriolanus, where he says he was the author of himself, and I kept thinking that about Balanchine all the way through your book, actually.
Exactly.
Do you think Kirstein was in love with Balanchine? Do you think it was, I mean, I know it was a complicated and fairly distant relationship, but what do you think Kirstein's feelings for Balanchine were?
Kirstein is the longest relationship of his life. It's not a love relationship in any kind of romantic sense at all. Kirstein was gay but married. Balanchine was very heterosexual. There was no deep connection between them, no affinity necessarily, but they stuck by each other, and they were both loyal. And Kirstein didn't let go. There were many points in the years to come that they could have gone their separate ways, and did for a moment during the Second World War. But they stayed together, and they were like two trees planted to the same spot. And it's a bit of a complicated story, but Kirstein arrived himself at the idea that dance was the art form of the 20th century, and that it was the place where he was going to invest all of his energy and time. And he saw very early on that Balanchine was someone who also believed that.
And in those early years in the United States, Balanchine was sort of moving from one coast to the other, wasn't he? Broadway on the East Coast and Hollywood on the West, and encountered some extraordinary people. What did you make of Irving Berlin and Fred Astaire and Richard Rodgers, people like that?
I think he admired all of these people. He was doing Broadway because he was interested in it. He wrote songs himself. He composed very sentimental lyrics, love stories, all of them. He admired them. It wasn't what he really wanted to do. These were, as he put it, commercial dances, and he was interested in eternal dances. But I think he learned a lot, especially from his experiences in Hollywood and making film. He was lucky enough to work with Greg Toland, a cameraman who was changing cinema at the time. And his way of seeing the stage had an almost cinematographic quality after that. And the question of how do you guide the audience's eye to various points on a stage in time was something that I think he took a lot from cinema.
He was quite a fan of Fred Astaire's, wasn't he?
Oh, he thought Fred Astaire was the greatest dancer ever. And why? I think because he was somebody that had this kind of elevated, again, here we are in the world of trying to take dance out of the everyday to elevate it through the physical body. So you're trying to sort of achieve something. And Fred Astaire, is just a delight to watch and is the consummate aristocrat, American aristocrat, and somebody who can move through dance with ease and joy. I mean, he loved Fred Astaire. He never worked with him, but he did love him.
And then in 1948, this huge event in American dance and world dance history takes place, really, doesn't it? That he becomes the principal or founds the New York City Ballet. How did that come to pass?
Yeah, this was a project, when Lincoln Kirstein brought Balanchine to the United States in 1933, they first tried to set up a company in Hartford, Connecticut. And that failed very quickly because Balanchine was kind of, what is this Hartford, Connecticut thing? Let's go to New York. And they founded a school very easily, in a way. I mean, it happened right away in 1934. But the company was just, they tried many times and failed and failed and failed and failed. So in 1948, they finally found somebody who believed in Balanchine as much as Kirstein did at the New York City Center, who proposed to them, would you make the small company that they were at the time called Ballet Society into the New York City Ballet? And, Lincoln Kirstein said, if you do that for me, I'll give you the greatest dance company America has ever seen. And so they began. And it's not that all of a sudden the New York City Ballet was established and a sure thing. For years, right into the 70s, it could have fallen apart so many times. There were always budgetary issues. There were always problems. It was a struggle from the start and to the finish, really.
Balanchine himself is not a kind of conventional figure for a biography or a big biography as a personality, is he? It seems to me that he's not anyway. Tell us a little bit about his character, about his personality. I know that you actually did classes with him, and I want to ask you about that shortly, but what sort of person was he to meet?
Yeah, he's a very elusive person. He was married 5 times. But I'm not sure anyone knew him in a kind of intimate way except through his art. He was somebody who really lived for that. I was in this experience of living with him for 10 years while I was writing the book. I mean, I talked to no one more than I talked to Balanchine in my mind. I lived with him really for most of my days. So, and I was very, very focused on trying to get into the inner life and into his imagination. The book charts a path really from the same path he charts in his life, from the real life into the what he called realer than real world of the stage. This other world that he built around himself by building the New York City Ballet. Because the thing about dance is that you can't have dance without dancers. And you can't have dance without a stage, set designers, lighting design. It's a whole apparatus. And so the founding of the New York City Ballet was also the making of an institution that would support his art. And he did that too. So his personality was in a way subsumed by all of this. He was modest. He was he knew his talent, but he was quiet, soft-spoken. He was not a tyrant, even though he was, you could say, an autocrat in the sense that everything came back to him eventually, and he ran the place as he felt it should be run. He also gave people a lot of latitude. If he trusted them, he let them go. And that goes with the dancers too. So he's a kind of very internal, very private. As a subject for biography, as you were saying, difficult in many ways because he purposefully destroyed a lot of his own papers. He didn't believe in the past. He believed in the present. And so he was not, as Lincoln Kirstein said when he first met him, he doesn't have a single clipping of reviews or anything like that. He's got nothing. So his papers are full of things like credit card statements and the correspondence that his assistants kept. And we do have some very important love letters that show a deeply romantic side, deeply romantic, kind of tragic romantic, Romeo and Juliet side.
You quote him as saying in your book that ballet is woman, which is a very arresting and immediate quote. What does he mean by that? Because it touches upon one of the big themes of your book, I think.
Yeah, no, exactly. And ballet as woman it means many things. It means that women have bodies that are more flexible and have more potential as a tool of art, in his view. And he really, he changed technique of ballet by changing especially how women moved. And he did that with them. It was a process that they were both involved in because it couldn't be done. If the dancer is the tool, the dancer is also the master of her tool. And so the collaboration between them was very real. And I spent a lot of time talking to dancers about the ways that they worked with him and the give and take in the ways in which they, as I came to see it, sculpted their bodies and changed their own physical forms. And then ballet as woman was also something that was very central to his own inner artistic life. It's not so much that women inspired him, it's that women were his partners in art. And I don't just mean women, but eroticism and the erotic side of a relationship with a woman and with many women. I think he loved all of the women in his company in some degree or another. And, for all of the difficulties, and we can talk about those that presented themselves in working with him, and he could be ruthless and cruel, they stayed. And they always, when I would interview them, so many of them, most of them would stop in the end and just say, but we loved him. So there is this element, I think, between him and the dancers of, And between specific dancers, the women he married were all his most prized dancers at a given moment in his life. So the fact that there were 5 of them is, in a way, not surprising because he made so many dances. And he couldn't really sustain a domestic relationship, a marriage, as we would think of it. His marriage was the marriage to art. And the women eventually would tire of that. And mostly things would fray when they couldn't sustain his demands and dedication to making dances. That's what he was all about. And that's what love was about. And that's what women were about. And that's what dance as woman was about. It's also an idea of the eternal feminine, an old idea, a Goethe idea, a Nietzsche idea, an idea of the transcendent capabilities of femininity and of the female form. It's not an idea we think so much of these days, but it was very, very present in his mind, almost a Quixote Dulcinea search and quest.
You said a moment ago that he could be cruel and demanding. He did love all of his dancers, but he clearly loved some more than others, didn't he? And
oh, for sure.
that some of the behaviour today would probably be characterised as. Would you think it would be fair if some of the behaviour viewed through the prism of today was viewed as coercive and controlling, or is that?
Yeah, coercive, controlling, in some cases even abusive. I mean, it's such an interesting relationship that he had with his dancers because, the ones that he especially focused on, let's just take those as an example, but, he was very possessive. He needed them so much because he couldn't make his art without them. And he invested enormous amount of energy and time into helping them become who they were as dancers. And so what this could mean is, please don't have boyfriends because that will take you away from the project that we're doing together. And he was jealous. And so they would, these are like almost cultish behaviors, where there's a sense that they're meeting their boyfriends on the corners a block away from the theater so that he won't know that they exist. There's a possessiveness about the body and the human form.
And then weight as well.
And their weight, exactly. Exactly. The whole idea that their bodies were something that he wanted to control. So if they weren't the right shape or thin enough, or he wanted to see muscle and bone. Sounds terrible. Sounds kind of gruesome in a way. But the idea was that he was trying to reveal the human body. And, he didn't take into account the toll that this would take on these young women who were, after all, very young, 17, 18, 19.
Some of them found different ways of rebelling, some of them, didn't they? You write in your book.
Yeah, they did find ways of rebelling. Some of them just left. That was one way to rebel. Others...
they cut their hair, I think you said.
Yeah, in one case, he loved the long hair, and so she comes in with with her fine locks just sheared. It's almost an adolescent kind of relationship because they are adolescents.
Yeah.
These young women. And yet they're also the objects of this extraordinary love, and they have, all of them, a great, great desire, their own desire, to dance and to perform his ballets. He always said, they loved me for my ballets. And he meant that a little bit sadly. They didn't love me as a man. And that was true, that they loved him for his dances.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes there have been earlier accusations that the New York City Ballet was run like a cult by Balanchine. How do you respond to that suggestion in your biography?
I mean, I think there's some truth to that. And the weight thing, just to take one example, that is because it's so visceral and we can feel it so acutely today. The weight issue, there was a sign up on the theater wall at one point that said, to get your pay, you must weigh. And it's in Balanchine's hand. This is one of the things I found in the archives. Was this so extraordinary in the world of dance, where contracts often specified that your body had to be in a fit shape to do dance, whatever that meant to a director at the time? Not so, but he could be tyrannical about it. So it was hard. The cultishness was even a bigger issue, though. It had to do with the sense of walls being built around this artistic enterprise, so that, almost if you think about it like the theater walls, he built a theater, the New York State Theater at Lincoln Center. He built a company of dancers. He built a team of designers and musicians, and all of these people were engaged in his vision. And there was a feeling of a closed circle. One dancer put her arms in front of her and locked her hands. Either you're in or you're out. And the idea of there are secrets within this circle, including things like the weight and some ugly things, also some beautiful things. A very complicated, mixed world. This world was, I think it was cultish in the sense that it was closed and it had rituals and requirements that you had to live up to if you were going to be part of it.
You are yourself a former professional dancer. You took classes with Balanchine, I think, and you danced in several of his ballets. How does your sense of Balanchine now contrast with your experience of him as a younger dancer? How does your younger self compare to your biographical self in your view of Balanchine?
I mean, my view of him changed enormously. My view of him as a young teenage dancer at his training at his school, and then later performing his dances with the Pacific Northwest Ballet. And as you say, I was lucky enough to take a class with him and to study with some of his greatest dancers. There was a way in which he was a sort of almost godlike figure in that world when I came into it. And we saw him as someone who, there was a mythology around him that had to do with, we don't look back, we don't ask questions, we just submit and do what the dances tell us to do. As I came to know him over the last 10 years in writing about him, just all of the sort of fullness of the man came out, the difficult sides, but I suppose, above all, the sadness of his life. There's a great sadness in this life. Somebody who was able to achieve an extraordinary artistic form, a sort of relentless quest for beauty and for newness in art. He was really an avant-garde artist, and many of his dances that have been forgotten are strange and interesting. He wasn't, as Lincoln Kirstein put it, a ballet choreographer. He was always looking for the progressive edge and how to move the art form on into the future. So he achieved all of that. But he was very alone. In spite of being surrounded by all of these people, he was very alone. And he was alone with his own artistic process and alone with his life, and he died alone. And he had a lot of physical difficulties and tragedies in his life. He was, his family was back in Russia. He was alone in a deep, deep way, the deep way of exile. The ways in which it wasn't cultish was that it wasn't the submission to a man or a certain personality or person. It wasn't. It was really, the submission was to the art that they were making through him. So I think that's why a lot of people tolerated it and stayed, because there was a sense of service. And this was very important to the dancers I spoke with and to Balanchine himself, the sense of service to an art form, and in Balanchine's case to God, because he was a very religious man. So, even though there's this cultish behavior, it's not, it's not Jim Jones. It's not like a person who's sort of an ego. It's the opposite of that. It's a sort of loss of ego and a selfless pursuit of art that takes, at times, a very, very high toll.
Towards the end of your book, you say that Balanchine's best ballets were fantastic entertainments that lifted audiences into the great good humour of being alive, which I thought was a wonderful line. What did you mean by that? And that will be a very fitting way to conclude the conversation.
Well, I was remembering partly my own experience and the experience of being in the theater, which was in the years when he was alive, and I was there in the 1970s. And you would leave the theater after a great performance just feeling like everything was okay for a moment. Terrible things might be happening in the world, but for a moment you felt life matters, art matters. There's a way in which we were all, and it's a feeling which depends on a community being gathered, and that's, I think, what the theater was, as he put it himself. He wanted to make a cathedral of dance. It's almost a church and of art, and so you would leave the theater just feeling great, and the other people around you felt great.
I think our audiences will feel great too at the end of this conversation. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that. It was absolutely wonderful. That is, I'm afraid, all we have time for today. We'd like, as always, to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued and generous support of this podcast. The winner of this year's Baillie Gifford Prize will be announced at an awards ceremony at the Science Museum in London, also generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation, on Thursday, the 16th of November, and will receive a cheque for £50,000. That announcement will also be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction social channels. If you're interested in finding out more about the prize, you can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, or you can visit our social media feeds on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at BG Prize. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.